Hi everyone, it's Chris again. In this video, I want to talk about how I like to work with my projects using Git and a modification on GitFlow with some pull requests. I found this to be a pretty handy way to work with your repositories and your teams, so hopefully it'll be helpful. I've had a couple clients ask me about that recently, and you can follow along with the blog post that accompanies this video at crispycode.ninja, and you can see my contact information down below. Crispy Today on LinkedIn, Crispy Today on GitHub, and I'm a client solution manager at Magenic. I've been a developer and architect for over 15 years now, primarily on web and mobile space, although I have fairly sorted past with data and analytics and other kind of projects as well. And I have a huge amount of experience with using Git. I've probably been using Git for, nearly 10 years, and I've been using GitFlow for a large portion of that time. And I found it to be really, really helpful. And then a couple modifications that I tend to use, ways to inject pull requests into that we'll be going through in this video. So the first thing I want to do with a new project is create a repository for it. In this case, I'm going to create it in Bitbucket, but the process is very much the same, regardless of where you're setting it up. So if you're using GitHub or VSTS, it'll be a very similar process. Set up your repository, maybe commit a couple files, and then you'll be working with it locally, making those clones, and then start going through the GitFlow model. So you can really follow along with this, even if you're not using Bitbucket. So I'll start by creating a repository. I'm going to call it GitFlow demo. It'll be a private repository using Git. Similarly to different repositories, if you're using Mercurial instead of Git, they're both distributed version control systems. Using them on a day-to-day basis is very similar. So the flow and the process for this branching model will work very much the same. There certainly are differences between Git and Mercurial under the covers, but in day-to-day using them, I've switched back and forth from project to project, and I don't find it to be too disruptive. So if you are using a Mercurial project, certainly don't feel like this will be wasted on you. The process is very much the same. So let me create this repository. It gets created very quickly, and I'll just add a couple of the default files that you typically want to have. I'll create a git ignore. I'll just leave it at the default, and I'll create a README, also using the default. So at this point, if I go under commits, you can see I have the two commits that I just did, creating the git ignore and the README file. And you'll see I just have one master branch. Similarly in source, we can see the same thing, the git ignore, the README, and just a master branch. So now that I have this online repository, I want to set it up locally. So let me create a local clone. And to do that, the tool I like to work with is a free tool from Atlassian called SourceTree. So let me hop over to SourceTree and get started on my local repository. So here's SourceTree. I'm on a Mac. It looks slightly different when you're on Windows, but you should be able to follow along nevertheless. I'm going to click over to remote. I've already supplied my Bitbucket credentials, so I can see all my repositories here. And down here you'll see this is the GitFlow demo that I just created. I'll say clone, and it will fill in the source URL. I can provide the destination path and give the repository a name. Then I'll say clone. Once it's cloned, it'll pop up with this window so I can see the status. I have a master that's tracking along with that remote master. That's the origin/master. So now that I have my repository, I want to start setting it up for the GitFlow branching model. So let me go into repository, and you'll see there's a GitFlow option, and it says initialize repository. So that's what I want to do. And you can see it has the default naming conventions already supplied. If you need to change this for your organization, you certainly can, but typically I leave it at the defaults. So you just say OK. And you'll see it's created now a develop branch for me that's based off the master. Now, just so I can tell my develop branch apart from my master, let me go ahead and create just an initial file for this project. So let me open the folder that has my local repo up in Visual Studio Code. I'll close the welcome message, and I'll create a new file in here called index.html. And I'll just copy the starter template from Bootstrap So I'll just save that, and we can launch that over in our browser to see the simple hello world pop up. Popping back over to source tree, I have some uncommitted changes, so let me go ahead and commit that index file. I'll give a message. In this case, I'll go ahead and push this change immediately up to my repository and say commit. So now we can see a little bit of difference. My develop is now a little bit different from my master branch. We can also pop over to Bitbucket, and if we refresh our source, we'll see master's the same. I have a Git and a README, but if I switch over to develop, I now also have this index file. So now that we can see this difference, let's get started with the actual GitFlow branching model. So I'll go back over to source tree, and now you would imagine you might have different development teams that are going to start working on different features, start building things out. And under the GitFlow model, the way you want to do that is through some feature branches. Now source tree helps you along with this. So if I go under repository and I go under GitFlow, you can see it has these handy options to start a new feature. So that's what I'll do. And in this case, I'll call my feature branch layout. And I'll grab a snippet of code, again from the Bootstrap site, for a simple 3-column layout, just so we can see some differences. And pop over to Visual Studio Code. Let me pop that in here, save, and we'll refresh the page, and now we can see we have this little 3-column layout in here. So under source tree, I can commit this again. And you can imagine if you're working with a team, you might want this feature branch to be accessible through your remote repository as well, so other people can get it. You can collaborate on work. So we'll create another commit message, or create 3-column layout, and we'll go ahead and push that up to our remote branch as well. So now other people could access this. They could do continuous integration. We could start pulling in changes. We won't try to simulate that for this demo, but you can imagine what would happen as we continue to build out this feature. Now in typical GitFlow, the next thing you would do is under this repository, you can go GitFlow, and you'd finish the feature off. It would close the feature and merge it back in with the develop. This is where what I do tends to be slightly different. I'll often do a pull request at this point once the feature starts to get elaborated on a little bit. Perhaps even before the feature is done, we might set up the pull request so that we can start to collaborate with whoever is overseeing the project. That would be the person who gets to review that pull request into the develop branch so that they can collaborate and provide input on what they want to see out of this feature. And then ultimately that pull request can be brought in to develop. So let's see how that would work. I'll pop back over to Bitbucket, and I'll go under pull request, and I'll create a pull request. And I don't want to do this all the way to master. I want to do this to my develop branch. So you could give it a title, provide some sort of description. In this case, I'll ask it to close the feature after the pull request is merged and create the pull request. Now you can do the normal pull request management. You can make comments, go back and forth until you're happy with the feature. For this demo, I'll just go ahead and say merge. If I go over to commits, you can see the path that's been merged back in. And you can see that remote path. And I'm going to switch over to my develop branch, check that out, and I'm going to pull. And then I could delete this layout feature branch since I no longer need it. Now from here, I could go through and under repository, I could create a release. I'll say this is my release version 0.1. Now I typically go in and make some sort of small changes, updating things like the version number within code, just so we have something to commit. I'll go here and we'll say hello release. So this would just sort of simulate the small changes that might happen under a release branch. So we'll save that. We'll say update verbiage. And again, we're going to go ahead and push it up to the remote repository. Now you wouldn't necessarily do that in a real repository. You might have several local commits before you want to push it up. This is just for demonstration purposes so that we can create additional pull requests. So again, under the normal GitFlow model, you go repository, GitFlow, finish release, and that would merge it back into your master and your dev branch. Often you might have another stage within an enterprise environment where it needs to go through some additional reviews before it gets published. Perhaps some user acceptance testing, some additional more strenuous automated tests, things like that. So at this point we can go back to our Bitbucket and create another pull request. And in this case, we're going to go from the release to the master, and we have all these changes underneath. We could provide more description, set some reviewers, all the normal stuff, and then create the PR. Again, in a normal environment, there could be some back and forth. Maybe you want to see some things changed. Maybe there's even minor bug fixes that need to happen. Those could still happen in the release. That's fine. And eventually, hopefully, we get to a status where everyone's happy. We can approve and merge that in, and we can close that release branch. And then we go through the same sort of process to update our local repository. Now, one thing interesting, since I am under this release branch, see what happens when I try to pull. So let me say OK, and I'll get an error because that remote repository has now been closed. I closed that branch off. If I didn't want to get this, I could have left that branch open on my remote repository as part of that pull request. Remember, I said to close the release branch. So here I'll switch over to master. You can see it says my local copy is five commits behind what we have on the remote repository. So let me pull that in. Now the other thing you might think to try while you have this release branch here is what would happen if I went through the normal GitFlow and try to finish the release. So you select the 0.1. So that'll work locally. That's fine. And it handles all the merging back for you. You see it's done the merge into master, which we really already had from pulling from the remote, but also did the merge into develop. So that's nice. And we can go ahead and push that back up. And there we go. So you can start to see how you might work with the GitFlow model with pull request. Now you can modify this according to your needs. You don't necessarily have to do a pull request into your develop branch. That can be helpful for larger teams, but it might be a hindrance for smaller teams where maybe you don't need that much oversight. You could allow everyone to close their features locally, merge it back into develop, and then push that up to your main development branch. As long as everyone's sort of a good citizen in the repository, and like I said, it's not a massive team, that should work out fine for you. And then you could just do the pull request when you're in that release area. That might be fine for you. Other enterprises might even want to add some additional areas. Maybe you want something for your DevOps, additional CI/CD processes. So maybe you want another stage in there someplace to kick off additional functionality. If that helps you, by all means, do what works for you. Don't feel completely tied in. GitFlow is not the end-all be-all. It's just a good place for you to start. And hopefully this video helps you see how you can use things like pull requests that are so helpful, such a boon to working in a model like Git, a distributed version control system, and working that into the overall GitFlow model. So the only thing I didn't show is a hotfix. That would work similarly. In that case, I would go to master, GitFlow, start a new hotfix. May we call this wrong name. And I change this to, Mr. President. So there you can see a little change. And then the same process. Commit, push to the remote, create your pull request to pull that over into master. So hopefully it all makes sense. Fairly repetitive type of process. As you get used to it, it should become second nature. So one last time, go back into our pull request. We'll create a pull request. We're doing our hotfix. We're going to put it over into master, create the PR. You could imagine this kicking off a bunch of stuff in your CI/CD pipeline, doing all sorts of testing. I could also pull this down locally if I was the project lead, run this, take a look at it, make sure everything runs and I'm happy with it, then do the approval, merge. Just for fun this time, let's not close the source branch so we can see it. We'll do the merge. Pop back over to source tree. And it's not showing the change yet, so let me just go to origin and say fetch from origin. So now you can see that now that I did that fetch, now you can see that it's showing that my local master is 2 behind. Let me go ahead and do it this way. I'll GitFlow, finish hotfix. Oh, and you'll see I'll get an error because my master is behind, so it doesn't want to try and overwrite changes, which is fine. Let me cancel. In master, pull. I could have also done the fast forward commit, that's fine. Repository, GitFlow, finish hotfix, name fix. And finally I could push all of this back up. So there we go. You can see that that hotfix has been pushed in and everything's fine on my local repository. That hotfix still exists over here on my remote repository, which might not be what you'd want. Typically I would get rid of them, but it's up to you. If you want them to stay around, that's fine. So you can see that that hotfix name is still there. And you could remove it if you wanted. It's not critical, whatever makes the most sense to you. But if you did want to delete the branch, you could go under branches. You won't see it under active because it's been merged in now, but under merged, you could select the branch and delete the branch. And then it'll be taken care of. And again, while the interface will be different depending on what you're using for your remote repository, GitHub, VSTS, what have you, the process and the functionality should be the same. It'll just be a matter of navigating the UI to how do you handle your pull request, how do you manage your branches, but the overall process remains the same. So anyway, I found that to be successful on my projects and worked out pretty well. Last thing is, if you're new to GitFlow, I highly recommend going back to that original post on GitFlow. You can see the URL here. I'll post it up with the video as well as in my blog, and you can follow along with the post and this original image that you can see how things bounce back and forth. You can also do a search on GitFlow and you'll see lots of people talking about it and different examples of how they're working with it. There's some GitFlow cheat sheets out there, lots of things to help you get up to speed if you're new to this branching model. All right, well, thank you very much for watching. Hope this was helpful, and happy coding.